In the summer of 1900, a young man from Warsaw packed a single bag, walked to the nearest port, bought a ticket on a steamship, and arrived in New York City 3 weeks later. He had no passport, he had no visa, he had no documentation of any kind that a foreign government had approved his travel. He stood in line at Ellis Island, answered a few questions from an immigration inspector, passed a brief medical examination, and walked out into America. He was one of approximately 450,000 people who did the same thing that year, and the year before, and the year after. Between 1880 and 1920, roughly 24 million people entered the United States this way, without passports, without visas, without the permission of any government beyond the basic admission process at the port of entry. This was not a loophole, this was not a failure of enforcement, this was how the world worked. International travel without government-issued documentation was the global norm for most of human history. The idea that a person needed a passport to cross an international border, that a government had the right to require one, and another government had the right to refuse entry to those without one, was not an ancient principle embedded in the law of nations. It was a 20th century invention, and it was invented, like most things in this story, by a crisis that made the old system suddenly inadequate. The United States did not make passport requirements mandatory for American citizens traveling abroad until 1941. It did not require arriving foreigners to carry passports until 1918, and even then the requirement lapsed almost immediately after World War I ended. For most of American history, the border was, by modern standards, almost entirely open to anyone who could physically get there. This is the story of how that changed. Of the wars, the panics, the political calculations, and the bureaucratic decisions that turned the largely unregulated movement of people across international borders into the system of passports, visas, border controls, and immigration enforcement that governs international travel today. It is also the story of what the world looked like before that system existed, and of what was lost when it was built. The concept of a document authorizing travel is ancient. Rulers in the ancient world issued letters to travelers moving through their territory, documents that said essentially this person is under our protection, do not hinder their passage. The word passport itself derives from the French passer to pass and port, meaning gate or door. A passport was literally a document allowing you to pass through a gate. But these documents were not requirements for travel. They were protections sought by travelers who wanted official backing for their journeys, the way a modern traveler might want travel insurance. The vast majority of travelers in the ancient, medieval, and early modern world moved without any documentation at all because the infrastructure for issuing, verifying, and enforcing such requirements simply did not exist. The modern passport as a document, issued by a national government to its own citizens for use in foreign countries, developed gradually in Europe through the 18th and 19th centuries. France began issuing standardized passports in 1792 during the Revolution, primarily as a means of controlling the movement of its own citizens during a period of political chaos. Britain introduced a more systematic passport system in the 19th century, but these documents were exceptions rather than rules sought by travelers who wanted the protection of their government's backing rather than required by the countries they were visiting. The critical point is that these passports were outward-facing documents, letters from one government to another saying, "Please assist and protect the bearer," rather than inward-facing control mechanisms saying, "This person is authorized to enter your territory." The distinction matters enormously for understanding how the system worked. In a world where passports were letters of introduction rather than permission slips, the absence of a passport did not prevent travel. It simply meant you traveled without official backing. In the 19th century, this system, or rather the absence of a system, worked reasonably well for most of the people traveling internationally, because most international travelers were wealthy. Ocean voyages were expensive. The Grand Tour of Europe, that wealthy British and American families undertook, was a luxury product. The diplomatic correspondence, the letters of credit, the personal connections that smoothed international travel were available to the class of people who traveled internationally. What changed in the second half of the 19th century was the cost of ocean travel. Steamships made Atlantic crossings faster, more reliable, and dramatically cheaper. The journey from Liverpool to New York, that had taken weeks under sail, could be accomplished in 10 days under steam by the 1870s, and the price had fallen to the point where a working-class European family could afford a third-class ticket if they saved long enough. The great wave of mass immigration to the United States that began in the 1840s with the Irish famine and accelerated through the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s was made possible by cheap steam passage. The people coming on those cheap tickets were not wealthy travelers with letters of introduction and diplomatic connections. They were peasants from southern Italy, Jewish families fleeing pogroms in Russia and Poland, agricultural workers from Hungary and Slovakia, craftsmen from Greece and Croatia, all of them moving toward a country they had heard offered wages and opportunities that were unimaginable in the villages they were leaving. They came without passports because they did not have passports because their governments had not issued them passports and because the United States did not require them. What the United States did require at Ellis Island and the other ports of entry was a medical examination and an interview. The medical examination looked for contagious diseases, for physical or mental conditions that officials believed would make an immigrant unable to support themselves. The interview covered a basic set of questions. Who are you? Where are you from? Who do you know in America? Do you have a job waiting? Do you have money? The overwhelming majority of immigrants, something like 98% of those who arrived at Ellis Island, passed these checks and were admitted. The legal framework for this was almost entirely statutory rather than constitutional. Congress had the authority to regulate immigration under its power to control naturalization and its broad power over commerce and borders. The immigration statutes passed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries established categories of people who could be excluded: the sick, the criminal, the pauper, the contract labor who had been promised a specific job before arriving. But they did not require passports. They required the immigrant to be admissible under the applicable statutes, and admissibility was determined at the point of entry by immigration inspectors, not by any prior documentation requirement. This system had critics from its earliest days, and the criticisms came from several directions simultaneously. Nativists argued that unrestricted immigration was diluting the American character, undermining wages, importing radical politics, and creating urban poverty. These arguments were most intensely directed at specific groups: the Chinese, whom Congress excluded entirely in 1882, the Southern and Eastern Europeans, who were coming in the largest numbers by the 1890s and early 1900s, and the Japanese, who were restricted by the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, in which Japan agreed to limit the immigration of its own workers in exchange for a promise that the United States would not pass explicitly anti-Japanese legislation. Labor organizations argued that unrestricted immigration undercut wages by flooding the labor market with workers who would accept lower pay. Industrial employers, unsurprisingly, took the opposite view, seeing cheap immigrant labor as a competitive advantage. The public health establishment was concerned about disease. The great cholera panics of the 19th century, in which epidemics were associated with immigrant ships arriving from infected ports, produced pressure for stricter inspection regimes and the idea that immigration control was a public health measure. None of these pressures immediately produced a passport requirement. They produced increasingly elaborate statutory exclusion categories, increasingly detailed inspection processes at ports of entry, and the gradual bureaucratic infrastructure of immigration control. But the fundamental model, anyone can come as long as they can get here and pass the inspection, remained in place. The first major disruption to this model came not from immigration pressure, but from war. When the First World War began in August 1914, European governments almost immediately imposed travel restrictions that had not previously existed. The British government, which had been one of the most open to travel among the major European powers, passed the British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act in 1914, which required all aliens to register with the police and restricted their movements. France, Germany, and the other belligerents imposed similar measures. The logic was military and security. In wartime, governments needed to know who was crossing their borders and why, to prevent enemy agents from moving freely and to control the movement of military-age men who might be avoiding conscription. These wartime restrictions included passport requirements. For the first time in modern history, European governments began requiring travelers to carry passports as a condition of crossing international borders, not as letters of protection, but as identification documents subject to government control. The League of Nations Conference on Passports and Customs Formalities in 1920 attempted to standardize these wartime measures and extend them into the post-war period. The United States entered the war in April 1917 and followed suit. The Passport Control Act of 1918 made it a crime for American citizens to travel abroad without a passport during the war and required arriving foreigners to carry passports issued by their home governments. This was the first time in American history that passports were legally required, rather than merely useful. The war ended in November 1918. The passport requirement did not immediately end with it, but the post-war period saw significant political pressure to return to pre-war norms, and Congress let the wartime restrictions lapse. By 1921, the mandatory passport requirement for American citizens traveling abroad had been removed. Foreigners arriving in the United States were technically required to have passports, but enforcement was inconsistent and many arrived without them and were admitted anyway. What replaced the passport requirement as the primary mechanism of immigration control was something more fundamental and more durable: numerical quotas. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924 established national origin quotas that dramatically restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and effectively banned immigration from Asia entirely. These laws did not require passports. They required that immigrants come from approved countries and approved numbers. The enforcement mechanism was not documentation, but numerical caps. Once a country's quota for a given year was filled, no more immigrants from that country could be admitted, regardless of their individual qualifications. This shift from documentation requirements to numerical restrictions is important for understanding the structure of American immigration control. For most of the 1920s and 1930s, the primary barrier to immigration was not a passport system, but a quota system. A person without a passport who managed to arrive at an American port of entry and was from a country with quota slots available might still be admitted. A person with a perfectly valid passport from a country that had exhausted its quota for the year would not be. The passport was useful for identifying nationality, which determined which quota applied, but it was not itself the admission mechanism. The 1930s brought a different kind of pressure. The Great Depression reduced emigration and immigration simultaneously, as the economic conditions that had driven people to leave their home countries in search of better wages disappeared when the wages disappeared everywhere. Immigration to the United States fell to a fraction of its pre-war levels, not because of legal restrictions, but because the economic incentive was gone. You did not immigrate to a country where a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, but the Depression-era United States was also for a brief period engaged in mass deportation. The Mexican Repatriation, as it was called, resulted in the forced removal of an estimated 1 to 2 million people of Mexican descent from the United States between 1929 and 1936. Many of them were American citizens. The operation was conducted not through any formal legal process, but through coordinated raids, intimidation, and the offer of free train tickets to Mexico, which were in practice not always voluntary. The targeting was racial. If you looked Mexican, you were at risk, regardless of your citizenship status. This episode is relevant to the passport history because it illustrates the gap between the formal legal mechanisms of border control and the actual practice of controlling who is in the country. The United States did not need a passport system to conduct mass deportations. It needed a state apparatus willing to use racial identification as a proxy for immigration status. The passport was beside the point. The passport requirement that has persisted to the present day was established during World War II. Executive Order 8766, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in June 1941, made it a crime for American citizens to travel abroad without a passport. This order has been renewed and updated by subsequent presidents and has never been rescinded. The requirement that arriving foreigners carry passports, established in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 and subsequent legislation, has similarly remained in place. The logic for the wartime requirement was the same as it had been in 1918: national security. In a world at war with enemy agents potentially attempting to enter the country and American citizens potentially collaborating with foreign powers, the government needed to know who was who. The passport, as a government-issued identity document tied to a national registry, was the most effective available tool for that purpose. But the wartime requirement did not disappear when the war ended, as the 1918 requirement had. The Cold War provided a continuous justification for maintaining the security apparatus built during the Second World War. The Soviet Union was a persistent threat. Communist infiltration was a genuine concern, blown up into a domestic political hysteria by McCarthyism, but not entirely fabricated. The intelligence agencies built during the war needed peacetime missions. The border control infrastructure built during the war needed peacetime purposes. The passport requirement stayed, and with it a set of associated mechanisms. Visa requirements for foreigners seeking to enter the United States, exit controls in some periods that prevented American citizens from traveling to certain countries, the denial of passports to political dissidents and people deemed security risks. That last practice produced a significant constitutional confrontation, and Paul Robeson, the black singer and actor who had become associated with left-wing politics and had publicly criticized American racism, had his passport revoked by the State Department in 1950. The official justification was that his travel abroad was not in the national interest. The real justification was that Robeson was a prominent black American who was telling audiences in Europe and the Soviet Union that American democracy did not extend to its black citizens, which was embarrassing to the State Department during the Cold War. Robeson was unable to travel or earn income from international performances for 8 years. The Supreme Court ruled in Kent versus Dulles in 1958 that the Secretary of State did not have the authority to deny passports based on political beliefs or associations, striking down the practice. The decision was based on statutory interpretation rather than constitutional grounds, leaving open the question of whether the government could constitutionally restrict passport issuance based on national security grounds more narrowly defined. W.E.B. Du Bois, the civil rights leader and historian, had his passport seized in 1952 when he was 84 years old because the State Department required him to sign a statement affirming he was not a communist as a condition of passport renewal. Du Bois refused and was unable to travel internationally for 8 years. He received his passport back after the Kent versus Dulles decision. These cases illustrate something important about the passport system that tends to get lost in the bureaucratic normalcy of the document. A passport is not just an identity document, it is a permission slip. A government that issues passports has the power to withhold them, and withholding a passport is a form of house arrest, an exercise of state power that confines a person to the territory of their home country without any of the legal protections normally associated with detention. The State Department's use of passport denial as a political control mechanism in the 1950s was an expression of power that the pre-passport world did not have available. When the borders were open and documentation was not required, the government could not prevent a citizen from leaving simply by refusing to issue a document. Once the passport requirement existed, that power came with it. The history of the passport in the United States is not just the history of a